Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today, we are joined by John Collins, who is currently a professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia. His areas of specialization are the philosophy of language, generative linguistics, concept of truth, and philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Today, we will talk in particular about his book, Chomsky, A Guide for the Perplexed. Professor Collins, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thank you.
Yes, so could you maybe please tell us a bit about your background? When did you become interested in the work of Noam Chomsky, and how has he kind of influenced your philosophical views?
Okay, so my philosophical background is squarely within the analytical tradition. And I actually did my PhD on truth, in particular on Tarski and how Tarski relates to many of the contemporary debates on truth. And so even though Chomsky was kind of there in the background somewhat, I'd never really read him properly. It was only after I'd finished my PhD, I read his book from 1975, Reflections on Language, and I was completely fascinated, kind of blown away. It was kind of love at first sentence. And mostly because he seemed to be asking questions which were, even though I didn't kind of know it at the time, kind of there in the background for me. So I don't want to get too much into the kind of technical detail, but there's this kind of long tradition within the philosophy I was working in that saw something like the structure of thought or logical form as being quite distinct from, if you like, grammatical form. Mm-hmm. But then there's this question of, well, if that's so, how is it that the normal speaker can go from the grammatical form to a logical form? How does that work? And there was never really kind of satisfactory answer to that, I thought, within the material I was reading. And when I read Chomsky, it seemed that was exactly the problem he was concerned with. Mm-hmm. So he was both kind of alien, in a sense, which made it kind of exciting, but also in a way kind of spoke sort of deeply to his traditional philosophy I'd been working in. So I suppose it was those two things that I found most exciting.
That's very, sorry.
Yeah, and kind of subsequently, I kind of read, obviously, kind of a lot more, and I more or less always had that same kind of impression.
That's very interesting. So yeah, if we look at kind of Chomsky's most kind of general assumption of approaching language, it is kind of that the central features of language are going to be cognitive. So it is therefore not something we do. So it's not social, it's not cultural or historical entity. So kind of maybe unpack this starting assumption. What is the starting assumption and kind of what's the relevance of it?
Yeah, so I think probably the best place to start, which isn't actually where Chomsky himself kind of started in the 1950s, but at least by the time you hit the 1960s, the key phenomena in view is quite simply put, and it's that each normal human being, that's to say each human being, unless they suffer from some specific deficit or have a sort of, they're basically like, more or less in a box for the first 5 years of their life, will acquire a language. And any language could be acquired in exactly the same way. So the idea being, if you took a newborn baby from London and put you in Rio de Janeiro, it would grow up to acquire Brazilian Portuguese. Take a newborn baby from Rio de Janeiro, take it to London, and it'll grow up learning English. So in a sense, any language of the world is equally acquirable by any human being, but nothing else. Right? So rabbits don't do it, rocks don't do it, chimpanzees don't do it. Chimpanzees don't even do it even after you've trained them for years. So it's almost as if each human being just kind of reflexively acquires a language, and they can acquire any of these languages. So that feature seems to position language as if you like a kind of species property, right? It's a kind of property of our species, in much the same way as, you know, spiders spin webs and birds navigate and things like that. So it's not to say that there aren't a whole range of fascinating questions which one can ask about language from a kind of social or cultural or historical perspective. It's not denying the interest of those questions, but it's to say ultimately we are talking about a biological phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And culture, if you like, comes from having that basic capacity in place. It's not that the basic capacity is, in a sense, shaped by our culture in that sense.
Very interesting. Yeah, we will unpack this more and more during the call, but maybe now kind of on a very general, broad level. So Chomsky is, of course, very much known as a scientist, but also he's a philosopher. So maybe he has quite a unique approach of being both a philosopher and a scientist, which is quite unique nowadays, but wasn't maybe when we go 2 centuries back. So can you maybe elaborate on this? Like, how does Chomsky approach both science and philosophy, and why is he maybe different than others?
Yeah, that you make a very good point. I mean, the distinction between what we would nowadays call natural science from philosophy is pretty recent. Probably, you know, at the beginning of the 19th century, you find that kind of distinction pretty clear. So in a sense, Chomsky kind of does belong to that kind of older tradition. And this is the way I kind of think of it, although it's slightly kind of perverse. I sometimes think of Chomsky as if he's really concerned with very broad issues in the philosophy of science and how inquiry should be conducted. And it's as if he said, well, one way of doing philosophy of science would be to develop a science and see how one would develop a science. So you find, for instance, in his very, he wrote a very large book called The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory, which wasn't actually published at the time. It was only published in He says there that you could think of a general theory of, a general linguistic theory, as it calls it, as a kind of philosophy of science, right? So it's in a way of saying, what would a science of language look like? You know? So I think all the way through his career, even though I suppose he's, in a sense, best known as a linguist rather than as a philosopher, he's always been concerned with very, very broad methodological issues of how science should be conducted. Are there any kind of natural kind of constraints that should be placed upon inquiry, and so on and so forth? I mean, we'll probably talk later about issues to do with behaviorism and other things. And in a sense, his early criticism of behaviorism was, in a sense, that it wasn't, as it were, real science. It was, as he put it, a kind of play acting at science. So I think the philosophy has always been kind of central to it. I think you can see his kind of philosophical attitude quite clearly in his critique of behaviorism. His famous review of B.F. Skinner's book, which had a great influence on philosophy. And in there, the essence of his critique is that behaviorism isn't real science. It's play acting at science, because in a sense it's neglecting sort of key explanatory questions. And again, we will probably come back to issues to do with naturalism as well. So Chomsky has a particular understanding of naturalism, which departs somewhat from a kind of dominant philosophical conception of naturalism. But we'll come back to these.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, that quite nicely connects with it indeed, because Chomsky in his in his book, New Horizons in the Study of Language and Mind, distinguishes between kind of 2 sorts of naturalism. So you have methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism. So can you maybe explain this distinction and kind of Chomsky's critique or denial that kind of this thesis of metaphysical naturalism is actually coherent, and kind of how does he think about that?
Yeah, so the way he thinks of metaphysical naturalism is that it's a metaphysical claim about, in essence, kind of what there is. So metaphysical naturalism is really synonymous with something like materialism or physicalism.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this kind of idea that natural science has given us the kind of proper metaphysics, the kind of genuine ultimate building blocks of all there is. And so whatever there is going to have to be accounted for according to these basic building blocks. And if it can't be, then it's in some way kind of fictitious and should be kind of done away with. Chomsky has various kinds of criticisms of the sort of basic notions involved in this idea that science is in the business of making ultimate decisions about what there actually is in the universe. But his favorite conception of naturalism, hence the term methodological, is not a naturalism that makes substantive claims about what there is, but rather is just committed to a certain kind of method or employs just a certain set of some principles in its inquiry. So in that regard, what's key to naturalism for Chomsky is, I think, kind of two components. One component is that inquiry shouldn't be kind of tethered to or kind of beholden to a certain kind of commonsensical conception of phenomena. So, you know, in the way in which, for instance, we wouldn't turn around to a physicist and say, look, what you're saying is incoherent because my intuitive conception of matter just doesn't correspond to a 11-dimensional string. I mean, that's silly, right? We as it were, allow for physicists to freely depart from kind of common sense. And so I think that's one component where Chomsky's saying, look, one thing that really holds back inquiry into language is because we are, as we're so intimate with it, mm-hmm. we find it so much harder to give up certain commonsensical conceptions about it. Mm-hmm. And the other component, which is kind of related, is the idea that there aren't any, if you like, sort of a priori constraints about how things will ultimately turn out. So, for instance, you find a lot of discussion within, say, philosophy over the past, say, 20-odd years, 30 years, about naturalizing content, as it's often put. And the way these debates often go is they try to unpack notions of, say, meaning in terms of something like causation, mm-hmm. As if causation itself was some kind of physically, scientifically respectable notion. And you're saying, look, you know, the notion of causation is as much up for grabs as kind of anything else is. Mm. And allied to this is the idea that to be a naturalist is somehow to be kind of reductionist. Mm-hmm. As I said, the idea being whatever there is must in some sense be explained in lower level terms. Mm-hmm. But one of the things, say, which Chomsky is keen to point out is the history of science doesn't really develop in that way. So, for instance, you find, say, chemistry in some sense being somewhat ahead of a curve. When into even up to the 1920s, perhaps, a lot of what was going on in chemistry didn't really make sense according to the physics that people were familiar with. Mm. And it's as well the physics had to change rather than the chemistry. Another example which Chomsky himself doesn't mention is, for instance, problems which people had with evolution. So when evolution was first proposed in the middle of the 19th century, one of the problems people had with this was the time scale. It's like, look, hang on. The time scale you're talking about is too vast. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems here is to do with the sun, right? Because this problem of saying, look, the sun can't have a kind of fuel source, so you know we judge the universe to be longer. so to be younger than is allowed for according to evolutionary theory. Well, in a sense, you can say, look, the evolutionary theory was actually correct. It was the physics that was wrong, and you needed to develop nuclear physics in order to understand how the sun itself could kind of continue to generate heat. And so if you then adopt this position, say, in relation to language, one thing Chomsky is saying is that, look, it's perfectly reasonable to think that we have a very good idea, a very good naturalistic scientific conception of language, even if we don't really know how it's realized in the human brain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? So it's like somebody turning around and saying, look, this isn't real science because you haven't told us how these grammars which you're positing are in some sense realized in the brain. It says, well, it's true. I don't know how they're realized in the brain, but that doesn't make it in any way not naturalist, you know. And there are lots of examples throughout the history of science where, as it were, a kind of lower level science needs to be revised in order to kind of meet, in a sense, the kind of better standards that have been reached by a high level science. Yeah, so that's the basic gist of it. Yeah,
that's very interesting. And indeed, Chomsky says sometimes, indeed, we just have to look at the history of science to kind of approach these philosophical problems instead of only focusing on philosophy. Here, the history of science plays a major role, and we don't have to look that far back to actually get that sort of insight. And he's kind of saying, indeed, so let's aim for unification, but he's also adding to that, how far we get is not entirely clear, if full unification is even possible. And then he also gets kind of, in his view, if that's correct, about kind of our cognitive limits. Namely, there might be limits that kind of block us from getting to that sort of unification. So it's merely kind of a postulate of kind of a regulative idea, but not in kind of a Kantian sense, but still that allows us to at least go for unification, but how far we go is kind of up for grabs.
Yeah, I think the connection with Kant is actually quite kind of deep in a way. I mean, so I think part of a methodological naturalism is the kind of presumption of unity, so that one would always be seeking unification. But as you say, this isn't something that one can ever presume that one has arrived at in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's very interesting. And kind of one major problem that philosophers talk about is indeed kind of the mind-body problem. And Chomsky kind of has a unique view on this, I guess, where he thinks that the mind-body problem doesn't exist because it cannot coherently be formulated. So he kind of states then that Newton destroyed the notion of body a long time ago and kind of left the ghost in the machine intact. So that's kind of playing on Raoul. Normally it's used in the other way around, basically. So maybe can you elaborate on this? Why does Chomsky think indeed that materialism and physicalism currently cannot be coherently formulated, and why hasn't this kind of been taken serious potentially by a lot of philosophers, where kind of throwing up the notion of body as debatable is seen as kind of a strange move, I would say.
Yeah, so so I think, say if you go back to Descartes, the way Descartes is always well, I don't know always, but most often taught to philosophers, is that he doesn't really have any kind of proper worked out conception of body. It's all to do with how peculiar and mysterious the mind is, which one has, as it were, some kind of immediate access to. But in actual fact, Descartes had a very developed kind of physics. And he was the first person to develop the principle of inertia and things like this. So the way Chomsky reads Descartes, which I think is correct, is that the problem with mental phenomena is that they don't fit with physical phenomena. Now, and if one then assumes you've got the physical phenomena correct, then you've got this kind of problem. You've got, in effect, a kind of dualism there. So Chomsky's point, though, so when he moves on to, say, Newton and obviously further developments in physics, is that what really happened is that a fixed notion of body has gone by the board, right? So we no longer believe that there is a fixed notion of body. Certainly physics hasn't kind of provided us with any such thing. So if then a mind-body dualism, as it say did in Descartes, presupposes a kind of some clear conception of body in terms of which mental phenomena could be sort of deemed to be problematic or kind of mysterious, then you need to, as well, cash out. So what is the notion of body such that the mind is kind of mysterious, right? And his claim is this hasn't ever been kind of done, and in a sense it can't be done, because as we spoke about previously, it just seems that science just really isn't in the business, at least not anytime soon, of giving us a kind of clear enough conception of what a body is in some metaphysically robust sense, which is going to mean that the notion of mind is in some way kind of mysterious. I think one of the reasons, and I think you find this in some of the discussion by philosophers on this topic, that this kind of argumentative maneuver hasn't been taken up that well, is because there's a kind of presumption that, well, right, we don't know enough. We don't have a clear conception of body, but we know enough about bodies for mental states to be, in some sense, problematic. Right? So it's like we don't really need a clear and ultimate conception of body in order for there to be a kind of mind-body problem. Right? It's enough to simply know various kind of broad, large-scale properties of kind of matter, as it were. So William Lycan kind of has this line, and other people have this line. I'm not really kind of convinced by this response to the problem. I think one of the sort of background issues here is to do with the lack of a proper characterization of physicalism. So Carl Hempel, the philosopher of science, more or less contemporaneously with some of Chomsky's earliest discussion of these issues, raised, it seems to me, this kind of deep problem for the notion of physicalism, which has never been properly resolved. And it's simply put, it's something like this. Nobody's a materialist in a kind of old school sense, right? Like kind of Democritus, right? I mean, kind of, or Boyle or somebody, right? Nobody thinks the universe consists of these impenetrable kind of little things that bang into each other. Nobody thinks that. So whatever your materialism is, your physicalism is, it's going to have to be tethered in some sense to some notion of science, right? Yep. So materialism here, or physicalism, is informed by science, not simply by kind of a priori kind of speculation or intuition. But then Hempel says, well, what science is that? It can't be past science, because that's proved to be false in all kinds of respects. It can't be current science, because that's incredible hubris, as if, science is now over. And it can't really be like future science either, because what on earth is future science? Well, you would have already have to, in some sense, know the broad shape of possible future science. So I think it's that, I think for a proper mind-body problem to be seriously formulatable as a metaphysical problem, you do need some reasonably robust conception of the physical, and I think that's what we're lacking. So I think what you're left with, which Chomsky doesn't kind of deny, is just the issue you raised earlier, a kind of unity problem. So you have a range of phenomena over here, range of phenomena over here. How do these two things kind of interact? And but those kinds of unitive phenomena are kind of all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so you would need a reason to think that there's something ever so peculiar and strange about the sort of mind kind of, as falling outside of a kind of unitary conception of the universe. And, some people think that they can spell out precisely what it is that's ever so different about the mind. But, I suppose you'll have to, I suppose it just becomes a matter of kind of judgment or kind of debate about how plausible these characterizations are.
Mm-hmm. And again, actually, a lot of it actually still relies on kind of the methodological question. That's kind of the main question that we have to answer. And I also remember that Chomsky sometimes says it's actually really rarely that we can do ontology. So does that tie in some sense with just his methodology and kind of, in some sense, is deflationary in the sense of we're not making these commitments yet because we're not in the position to make these positions?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. I mean, it's kind of really striking that where you have problems of unification in science, they become very kind of vivid and interesting once you have really well-developed theories in both domains. And then you say, gee, these things don't fit together, even though they're really well-developed. And they work. I mean, the obvious example is something like general relativity and sort of standard model in quantum mechanics, right? These things don't fit together, even though they're excellent theories. Whereas if you look at those sort of mind-body issues, it's like, look, you don't really have a kind of excellent theory of the various kinds of mental characteristics which you're worrying about. So it's as if, look, these issues of kind of mind-body integration, as metaphysical speculation, are kind of, skirt being empty. What you really should be doing is develop theories of the various phenomena you're interested in, and then see how these fit together with, kind of related theories, rather than just kind of worry in the most broadest terms of how these various phenomena fit together. So again, the admonishment would be, as it were, kind of do theory, do science, and see where you end up at, rather than thinking that there's a broad kind of incoherent metaphysical distinction that should guide science or put a brake on science.
That's very interesting. So, and a little bit before, I already kind of referred to kind of this regulative idea of like a unity that we're striving towards. And I always wonder, what does Chomsky think about kind of these normative principles, like looking for simplicity, beauty? Because I rarely see him talk actually about normativity or just the term of normativity. So how does he approach that? Because I mean, I know that simplicity does play a role, but I'm not entirely sure in what sense of simplicity he's talking about. So could you maybe say, what would Chomsky say about the people saying, science, of course, is doing all this descriptive work, but nonetheless we need this kind of normative principles to get the enterprise of science going?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. You're right. He doesn't sort of directly talk about these principles as kind of norms of inquiry. Although I think they're very much kind of there in the background. I mean, they certainly are there if you look at the detailed work in linguistics, which we'll kind of touch on later, I'm sure. So there's always been a kind of striving in the work for greater and greater economy and simplicity, even at the expense of coverage of phenomena. So what you kind of find, and this is a kind of continuous motif, is some principle that appears to cover a kind of range of linguistic data, but you, in a sense, kind of give up that general principle in order for some other principle that works incredibly well on a smaller range of kind of data, because it gives you a more kind of satisfying kind of explanation. And then you can kind of look back at the earlier principle and kind of see, yeah, it covered so much data, because it was virtually as complex as the data it was covering. So you're not really gaining much by way of kind of insight. The old principle looked pretty descriptive, whereas the new principle doesn't look descriptive. It can give you a kind of deep insight, even if you then have to give up on a certain kind of range of phenomena, or other phenomena become kind of problematic, because in one area you appear to have a kind of genuine kind of insight. And this issue comes up more broadly in something which Chomsky sometimes refers to as a science-forming faculty. So he thinks that our kind of ability to do science is itself a kind of cognitive competence, a kind of cognitive capacity. Somewhat different from other capacities, but still it's kind of rooted as we're within our nature. And I think underlying this idea is something like we find certain models of kind of explanatory depth and simplicity of principle and things like this, and very intellectually appealing. And if we don't find those kinds of principles in play, then we're kind of dissatisfied. And so he sometimes reflects on how it is that scientists can if you like, converge upon certain theories, and it's because the theories have certain kind of internal properties of being, very simple, offering very deep explanations, main is somewhat kind of restricted. So you find, again, say, to mention general relativity. General relativity gives you, for instance, a kind of understanding of how you get formations of stars and galaxies. But it's virtually like impossible to use the equations to, say, describe, say, like kind of dropping an apple from a tree. So you kind of give up on the kind of commonsensical stuff. It's just too complex, because it gives you a profound understanding of a different kind of phenomena. So I think part of what Chomsky kind of means by science is kind of normative, but it's as we're rooted in, he thinks, a sense of kind of capacity we have to formulate and favor theories that have certain explanatory virtues. That's a broad idea. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I never thought about that in that way. So that's very interesting. So maybe switching topics a little bit, Chomsky puts forward kind of his generative account of linguistics. And some opponents kind of claim right from the start that this approach will fail because it doesn't find, for example, space for communication or self-knowledge of language. And they deem these to be very crucial. So what is their objection kind of to Chomsky, and how does Chomsky respond to these sort of claims that are quite regularly thrown at him?
Yeah. So probably I'll focus on the issue of communication, because I think it's proved to be more kind of central. So there's a sense in which you could think of philosophy of language, as these analytical philosophy of language, from its inception as having a focus on language due to a certain kind of other minds problem. Right? So I mean, you find this clearly in Frege. Right? So Frege thinks that there's as well a kind of common kind of store of thoughts. So as to say, thought isn't something that's kind of private or individual. It must, in some sense, be kind of shareable, and you need, as it were, a kind of external kind of medium, something like a kind of symbolic form, in order that different people can, as it were, coordinate onto these shared store of thoughts. And running from Frege, obviously you go through, say, people like Wittgenstein and Quine and Davidson and Putnam and Kripke. The sort of social aspect of language, right? The fact that we can communicate, understand one another, have the same thoughts, and so forth, is deemed to be, as it were, precisely what language kind of gives us. And Strawson, Grice, I mean, basically wherever you look in 20th century philosophy, you find this idea. So, whereas what Chomsky kind of does is to focus on, if you like, the kind of internal mechanics, right? So it's kind of like, sure, we do communicate, but what are the internal mechanics that allow for this kind of communication to take place? So I think there's a sort of sense in which you could think of a number of philosophical responses to Chomsky as posing a certain kind of challenge of something like, what you need to do is to show how, I suppose, it's a story of how you go from those kind of internal mechanics to the fact that we have these shareable thoughts. Right? And if you can't do that, then in some sense, you're liable to fall into a certain kind of solipsism, right? Or make the facts of communication impossible. That's the sort of the basic shape of a challenge. But I think one of the problems with this kind of view, well, it's kind of twofold in a way. I mean, one problem is, but look, there has to be the internal mechanics, right? So there's no denying that. Right? I mean, if one were to deny that, then it would be as if you were to think that the rabbit, after all, could acquire English. They just happen not to. They're not in the right surroundings or something. Right? So you have to posit the internal mechanics. And the other thing is that even if one thought that there was in some sense a kind of external language, the same kind of challenge would arise. So I mean, it's to say something like this. If language is external, or if thought is external, then I can still wonder whether you are, as it were, connecting up to the same thought or have the same meaning as I do. I mean, so it says the same kind of the same problem arises. I think the ultimate kind of answer to this, though, is that Chomsky isn't trying to give an account of communication, or even to be directly contributing to it in a way. It's more saying, look, communication is a massive kind of interaction effect. It involves a whole range of different kinds of sensitivities and kind of knowledge which people bring to the table. It's a kind of gross idealization to think that there is something called like the meaning of a sentence, which is always, as we're clearly given in a kind of communicative situation, right? As if communication is always a kind of successful sort of activity. I think this is like communication is always rather a kind of more or less affair, and people more or less communicate if they are, as well, more or less the same, right? But that then just kind of relativizes the notion of communication. It's not that to understand communication, one must think that there is a discrete kind of meaningful entity that is communicated. I mean, I think that's a sort of basic kind of drift of his reasoning.
Very interesting. And maybe related to this, so many philosophers have also been talking about the notion of a public language.
Yeah.
Chomsky again thinks that this notion is quite problematic, or at least that it hasn't been sufficiently explained what it actually is. So maybe how does this relate to indeed the communication question, and what are these philosophers trying to do that are trying to say, no, there is this public notion of language that we can use?
Yeah, so as I suggested earlier, the idea that language is public is, or has been, something of a kind of dogma throughout the 20th century. And there are lots of different ways of sort of spelling out this sort of basic idea. So Quine, for instance, thought of language as effectively a set of kind of dispositions to utter things. If you're, say, someone like Gerald Katz, you think of language a bit like somebody might think of mathematics, as in some sense kind of out there kind of anyway, and we're to kind of access it. Other people just assume that whatever language is, it's something that's kind of public, but they don't go into the kind of metaphysics as well, or the detail of what this kind of public thing kind of might be. I think Chomsky's objection, and again this relates to the issues to do with naturalism and methodology, to this conception of public language stuff, is simply that it doesn't appear to kind of contribute to any explanations we may wish to offer. So, for instance, I just spoke before about communication. Naively, you might think, but look, public language is surely required to understand communication. But then if you have, say, a view of public language where it's a bit like mathematics, like some abstract structure out there, it's like, well, that doesn't really help anybody communicate. Because the same skeptical worry can be posed. Is like, how do I know I'm connecting up with the same abstract stuff as you are? I mean, I don't know, and if you root it more in terms of just people's kind of behavior, then you're going to have to then start worrying about, well, that looks as if it's a more or less thing, right? So the notion of language then becomes very, very messy. So, we speak of English and Italian and whatnot, but these notions are incredibly artificial. There's the old joke in linguistics that a language is a dialect with a army and a navy. It's the sort of idea that it's just a cultural sort of artifact that we speak in Italian or English or German, mainly due to just the kind of advent of mass education and a literary culture. But before that, there would, from one village to the next, would be speaking a slight language. So the problem with the notion of a kind of public language for Chomsky isn't so much that he has some arguments in his pocket to say that there can be no such thing. Maybe one could define the notion of a public language so that it was kind of coherent. It's rather that it doesn't appear to be required for anything. It's just the way we naturally speak, but we don't really have to speak that way, And when we look at any particular kind of phenomena, it doesn't appear to be entailed or presupposed by the kind of explanations we want to give of that phenomenon. That's the sort of basic idea.
Very interesting. And now kind of switching topics to kind of Chomsky's linguistics. So in your book, you also describe how Chomsky's predecessors focus merely on the taxonomic or descriptive task of linguistics. So how did Chomsky move kind of beyond this approach?
Yeah, so I think probably the thing to emphasize here is what subsequently came to be called universal grammar. So Chomsky has always been very concerned, and this is again something that relates to his naturalism. He's always been very much concerned with, if you like, negative phenomena. That's to say, he's always been concerned with questions of why not such and such, right? So if you're involved in a kind of descriptive task, you're correct if you manage to describe what's, as it were, before you. Right? But then you could say, well, right, I've got a good description of what's before me. Say, for instance, based upon some corpus, right? So you've gone out, you've gathered a kind of data set of utterances, right? Either elicited or not, right, of the speakers, and that's your language, right? But this doesn't really give you any angle on these why not questions, right? Because you can say, well, sure, that's the way things happen to be, but what if things were slightly different? Then what? Mm-hmm. And you go, well, I don't know. So again, to use an analogy with physics, if you take something like Kepler's laws, right, which basically tell you about the orbits of planets and satellites being elliptical and how the ellipses work, etc. If you were to say to Kepler, oh, you had these laws in hand, what would happen to the orbit of the moon if the Earth were to just disappear? Mm-hmm. Kepler said, I don't know. just nothing follows from that situation. So it, as it were, doesn't support kind of counterfactuals. Whereas with Newton, if you say what would happen if the Earth were to just disappear, you go, well, the Earth would go off for a tangent from its orbit, right? So he gives, which doesn't, it's not suggesting that the Earth is going to disappear or anything like that, but it, as it were, explains the actual by situating it within the space of a possible. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of Chomsky's conception of language. What he wants to do, and this is what's very novel, is not just to describe language as it just happens to be, but rather to answer why language is the way it is. And he does that by situating each language within a kind of a space of a possible. Space of a possible is what came to be called universal grammar. I mean, just to put things in a very humdrum kind of way, because I can seem a bit high-minded, take something very simple like ambiguity, like that a sentence is ambiguous. That in itself is interesting, because you may say, well, why should sentences be ambiguous at all? I mean, it's not, as it were, a good thing that sentences are ambiguous, because they don't aid communication. You know, if God were designing language to be a tool for communication, he wouldn't include ambiguity, right? Unless he had a sense of irony or something. Right? But there's a deeper question, and this is that ambiguity, structural ambiguity, is always highly constrained, right? So you never have kind of open-ended ambiguity, right? Any structural ambiguity is always like 2 ways, 3 ways, right? But it's never kind of open-ended. So right from the beginning, Chomsky was interested in these kinds of questions, right? Why is it that ambiguity is always constrained in this way? Mm-hmm. Why is it that this kind of construction is not acceptable? And to say it's not acceptable isn't equivalent to people don't use it, right? It's that, look, it's not that people don't use it. The question is, why don't they use it? Mm-hmm. Right? So again, the general, what was very different in Chomsky's approach, I think, is that he was concerned with explanation rather than description. And what explanation effectively means here is to be able to answer these kind of why not questions. Mm-hmm. You know, why isn't this sentence 4 ways ambiguous as opposed to just 3 ways ambiguous? And you get to answer those questions, as I said, by situating each grammar within a kind of space of possible grammars. So there are kind of, if you like, design constraints on what each grammar can do, and that's why you get answers to these kind of why not questions.
Very interesting. So in this book also you discuss indeed the weak generative capacity and the strong generative capacity, stating kind of that the strong generative capacity is kind of what Chomsky has always been interested in. So could you maybe explain the difference between the weak and strong generative capacity distinction and explain the relevance for Chomsky?
Yeah. So a weak generative capacity as a property of a kind of grammar, and at the moment you can just think of a grammar as just like as like a little kind of deduction engine. Right? He has some kind of principles and he allows you to kind of deduce things. The weak generative capacity is just the kind of strings of symbols. You could just think of them as A's and B's if you like, or zeros and ones, and it can generate. So if you're concerned with weak generative capacity, you're not in a sense bothered about how the strings are generated. Mm-hmm. You're just interested in that they are generated. Mm-hmm. So if you put this in a more kind of philosophical setting, you find, for instance, Quine saying, look, and this is in the 1950s, we judge a grammar just on what he called its extensional adequacy. So that means what you want a grammar to do is just to classify strings of words as being English, not English. That's it, right? You have two bins, as it were, an English bin and a non-English bin, and the grammar should just put each string is presented with in either bin. What strong generative capacity basically is just, in a sense, how the grammar generates that string. So each string then is analyzed as having a certain kind of structure that it has from the way it's generated. So a kind of simple way of thinking about this, well, I'll say simple, it may prove complicated, I'm not sure. But say you had an operation of just something like concatenation that just allows you to put one symbol next to another symbol, right? So if you had something like A, B, C, right, and the way you put that together was by getting C, concatenating it with B, so you've got BC, and then concatenating A to BC, right? So you've got ABC. There's nothing about concatenation that then, as it were, tells you that BC is, as it were, a component of that string. It's just ABC. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you had a kind of grammar that said, well, if you put BC together, call that X, and then you can put A to X, then that would tell you that BC is an X type thing, right? So that's the sort of essence of it. The idea is that a grammar in Chomsky's sense doesn't, as well, produce strings. What it does is structures that are defined in terms of effectively variables, which we would call noun phrases, verb phrases, these kinds of things. And all the principles of a grammar are defined on those kinds of variables. Right? So all principles of grammar are to do with verb phrases and noun phrases and these kinds of things. They're not concerned with the actual words themselves.
I see. That's very
interesting. So, yeah, so it's a sort. This then relates to the issue of a why not, right? Because if your grammar just basically says this string goes in the English bin and this other string doesn't go in the English bin, then that doesn't, as it were, tell you, well, why? Right? Or what properties do all of these strings have that go in the English bin? What's special about them? You say, well, I don't know, because my grammar doesn't tell me. It just tells me they go in that bin. So that's the sort. There are other more kind of mathematical issues to do with the difference, but we probably don't want to go there.
No, that sounds good. Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. So kind of Chomsky sometimes characterizes language as kind of creative, namely that it's typically novel, stimulus-free, and appropriate to context. And furthermore, Chomsky has indicated that this creativity might even be mysterious, falling kind of outside our theoretical understanding. So could you maybe highlight this aspect of creativity or this creative element to language that he always mentions as highly central or crucial, and something that Descartes saw before him?
Yeah, it's a curious thing, really, because Chomsky's been emphasizing this kind of aspect of our linguistic competence for, well, ever since really the mid-1960s. But it's something that's been kind of somewhat neglected. So at a certain kind of, kind of ideological level, Chomsky appears to be, a kind of mean-spirited, hard-nosed scientist who wants to remove all of culture and beauty from language and replace it with, grammatical principles that are inside the head. And, a lot of people can find that kind of alienating. But alongside that, he's always had this conception of normal language use as being creative. And he means this, he doesn't mean this in a necessarily a kind of poetical sense, but kind of. I mean, it's the idea at its most simple is that the human use of language is not, it is, as you said, it's characteristically novel. We produce sentences we've never heard. We hear sentences and understand them we've never heard before. Right? And this isn't a kind of quirk or something odd or at the margins. You don't need to go to poetry to appreciate this. It's just the absolute kind of norm. I mean, in fact, if you do hear bits of language again and again, they kind of stand out, like catchphrases or idioms. Right? So language in this sense is something that we, it seems on the one hand, they're just kind of making it up on the fly as we go along. Right? But nevertheless, they seem to be these kind of underlying kind of principles. So the reason then he sometimes suggests that this is potentially kind of mysterious, but maybe I should say something about mystery first before I...
Mystery and problem distinction?
Yeah. So Chomsky has this distinction between what he calls mysteries and problems. And the idea is that certain kind of phenomena might be mysterious, not because they're intrinsically kind of spooky, like kind of God might be, or the Trinity or whatever, but rather because we, like human beings, are in a sense too kind of limited, or you know, so what I was saying earlier about the science forming faculty, the idea being that if the kind of science that we can develop reflects the kinds of capacities we have, and our capacities are going to be particular and limited in all kinds of respects, then in principle, there could well be phenomena that lie outside of those kinds of capacities. Right? And as he sometimes says, to think otherwise is like astonishing hubris, or there's some kind of strange accident, right? As if the universe just so happens that everything is just so simple as to allow us to kind of understand it. Now, of course, we pursue science with the object of understanding, so we kind of imagine our universe to be amenable to our understanding. But whether it is or not is a kind of another question. Right? So the notion of a mystery there is just something that potentially falls beyond our capacity to understand it. And why he suggests normal language use, even it's very familiar and doesn't seem the least bit mysterious, is nevertheless really problematic. It's not so much because it's continuously novel, but rather that it's, as he puts it, uncaused, but nevertheless appropriate to the occasion. So it's like saying, we're in a situation where we can more or less say anything. It doesn't seem to be caused by anything in the situation we're in, but nevertheless we can kind of make sense of it.
Yep.
And he said, but this seems to kind of run up against various kind of broad principles we have of how we want explanations to go. So it's as if we've managed to kind of harness a kind of randomness.
Yeah.
But how on earth do you manage to do that? This relates also to issues to do with kind of free will.
Yeah.
Right. There's a very striking asymmetry between, if you like, perception of language and production of language. Right? So I cannot help but hear certain things as language, right? So I can't decide to hear what you're saying as noise, right? Even though it would be, say, noise to say a kind of monolingual Arabic speaker, let's say. I mean, if not noise, at least it might as well be, right? But so even though on one level, what you're doing is just producing noise, I cannot hear it as that, even if I want to. I can't decide that what you're saying is just noise, as it were. I have to hear it as English, as something I, at some level, can kind of deal with. But when it comes to production, I'm not elicited or caused to produce anything whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
I can just decide not to,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and or I can go and I can decide to say something kind of off kilter in some sense or other, you know. So the thought is that something like free will is something which philosophers who obviously have been much concerned with, but Chomsky's claim is perhaps most vivid in language use. And again, the kind of suggestion is because of its combination of kind of features that it seems to be based upon a kind of computational gizmo that kind of gives you the kind of, you know, an infinite range of things you can say, but nevertheless you're able to kind of harness that kind of infinite range and make sense of anything that happens within a linguistic kind of setting, kind of off the bat. This is something which, well, as he puts it, it's not even on the horizon of understanding. Chomsky is quite careful. It's worthwhile saying. So a philosopher like, say, Colin McGinn has taken up Chomsky's ideas of a problem mystery distinction and wants to say, you know, consciousness is a mystery, this other thing is a mystery, this other thing is a mystery. Chomsky has never said creative language use is a mystery. He simply says that the problem mystery distinction is a coherent one. And if you're looking for a potential example, then look, here's a kind of really striking phenomena, which is very hard to even begin to kind of inquire into. You know,
that's very interesting. Yeah. So maybe kind of two follow-up questions that come to mind. Kind of when we look at kind of this creative aspect, like, so we're saying that's kind of in normal languages that kind of already shows. Does that notion of creativity in language also inform our more broad or general notion of creativity? Is there any link? Has that been explored? And kind of a second question also related to that, it's uncaused, is kind of that I remember also Chomsky saying that it's neither deterministic but also not random, so that we kind of just lack the concept for anything that would label it. So maybe just two thoughts. I wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's in a sense the kind of problem. The uncaused aspect means, look, it's not deterministic, right? I can't get you to say something, right? But then it's not random because it's kind of appropriate, right? I can kind of make sense of a situation in which you're saying what you're saying. There are connections with other aspects of creativity. So you could think of, say, music, for instance. There has been work on what's called a kind of generative theory of music. And I think your John McHale, who maybe you'll be talking to later, has done work on moral reasoning. And Chomsky has made an analogy in this respect. So I'm thinking, look, the moral reasoning is in a sense kind of, it has these features of language where we're constantly confronted with kind of situations we're making moral decisions about, and we can be creative and we can inquire into it, but seem to work according to various kinds of parameters. So we can't just, you know, think of anything that's just convenient for us. But it's so yes, I mean, it's a sort of fruitful avenue of inquiry. Steven Pinker has kind of spoken a bit about this as well, about areas of creativity. I mean, there's one. This is actually something Chomsky suggested in an interview going way back, I think, to the late 60s. Is there's a kind of sense in which you could think of some kind of modern, or at least this is what his suggestion was, some kind of modern art, so probably especially music, as in a sense going beyond our kind of natural kind of capacities for aesthetic appreciation, right? So there's a kind of general failure of uptake in kind of understanding certain kinds of music or certain kind of literary forms. And this marks a kind of, kind of natural cognitive boundary. And there are kind of sorts of experiments you could kind of do in this area. So you could take, say like a kind of musical savant, and he may be able to reproduce, say, Schubert on kind of first hearing. When you give them some Schoenberg or Boulez, and it's like, what the can't do that. Do you know what I mean? So there may well be, it might well be that you're able to discern similar kinds of features of creativity, not just in language, but across the board. But I suppose this is somewhat speculative. But, in principle, you could kind of inquire into these different areas.
Very, very interesting. So maybe switching to kind of a central distinction of the cognitive term, namely that between competence and performance. Yeah. So can you maybe explain this important distinction for Chomsky and how it plays a role in Chomsky's thought?
Yeah, so at its most simple, performance, say if we're talking about language, just relates to what we do with language, and occurrences of performance of language. The idea of competence is, if you like, the underlying knowledge or principles of language that would inform such performance. Now, the distinction has been quite controversial, and each year there's some paper or other saying, let's undermine the competence performance distinction. But if you read what Chomsky said at the time, it's pretty clear that he wasn't meaning to, in a sense, downgrade performance, as if to say linguistic performance is uninteresting, let's think about competence. The thought rather was, look, if you're interested in a theory of performance, then you should be interested in a theory of competence. Because the general idea being, because performance is going to be in part shaped by a range of extra linguistic factors, right? Things like memory and attention, and things like this, right? And those things apply across the board, right? They're not specifically linguistic, right? Whereas there's clearly a particular linguistic component to linguistic performance. So it's a sort of idea of saying, look, if you're interested in performance, you're going to have to, as we fractionate it or break it up into something that's particularly linguistic, called that competence, and something that's more cognitively general, right? And so performance is going to be this kind of complex interaction effect of different systems. One of them is going to be specifically linguistic, and the others are going to be, kind of more general. So standard kind of examples of this would be where you have constructions that are unusable, right? But nevertheless make perfect grammatical sense. So so classic example is what are called center embeddings, where you place a relative clause inside a relative clause. So you'd have say something like the sailor, the dog, the sailor, the boat, the dog built sank, something like this, right? So in other words, that appears to, as well, so make no sense. Then you realize, well, what you're saying is that the sailor built a boat and the sailor was bit by a dog. Right? So when you kind of break it up, it makes perfect sense, and the grammar allows for it, except that there's something about the extra linguistic factors that say that basically mean you're not going to be able to handle in short-term memory these kinds of sensory embeddings. And it's kind of complex around the different kinds of phenomena, but that's the sort of general idea.
Very interesting. And kind of what I was thinking about as well is, so in the philosophy of science literature, has this kind of distinction been taken up as kind of looking at it from like a more general perspective, like how can we kind of apply this distinction to more fields of science?
David Marr, who was a real pioneer in the study of vision, was quite explicit in being influenced by Chomsky in this respect, and saying that any computational account needs to understand it effectively as a kind of complex kind of system with different components kind of interacting. And one of David Marr, in fact, had he has a little paper called Artificial Intelligence, A Personal View. And in it, he says, look, one of the problems with artificial intelligence is that it's not concerned with competence. It's just concerned with performance. It's just trying to get a machine to do something. Whereas what you really want to understand is what are the underlying principles involved in performing this kind of task. Right? And that's how, as we're natural systems, can perform these tasks. More broadly, I think in biology, there's a general understanding of modularity of any, like an organism or immune system and any kind of biological system is going to be made up of different components. So what you're looking at in terms of a broad phenomena is really an interaction of different components. And I think at its most basic, that's pretty much all Chomsky was trying to put his finger on with the competence performance distinction.
Very interesting. So moving on from competence to kind of his nativism. So Chomsky claims that this linguistic competence is native to the human mind/brain. So in other words, language is innate. So there are objections against this claim that state that Chomsky has not clarified this notion of innateness. So you state, and I'm quoting, first, the notion of the innate is not an explanatory notion, which is rather a theoretical term. It is simply a cover description for, in broad terms, the experience invariant structure of mind-brain. In these terms, the study of biology is simply a study of the innate, insofar as biology is not concerned with the unsystematic differences that mark out each individual organism. Thus, the crude claim, language is innate, is not a hypothesis, but simply a recommendation of a research topic. So could you please explain in more detail what the confusion is about the notion of innateness?
Yeah, so I think for Chomsky, there isn't really any controversy, or ought not to be any controversy, about innateness. He sometimes says, look, if one denies innateness in general, then one is saying there's no difference between a chimpanzee and my granddaughter. All he means by that is that to think of a capacity as biological means that its growth and development of it as a kind of phenotype is going to be a function of its environment and various, as well as internal constraints and design principles on that system, or say on that organism. So to say language is innate is just a way of inviting inquiry into those underlying principles, rather than imagining that there is no biological basis whatsoever, and language is effectively just a cultural phenomenon whose properties are going to vary across course of experience and vary across cultures. So it's kind of like saying, look, if one finds various universal features as a property of a species, they call for effectively a biological explanation. And that's kind of all he means by saying that these things are innate.
And that's very interesting. And why has it then been so controversial in some sense? Like, what are people reading into it that kind of makes it go beyond maybe what Chomsky kind of hints at?
Yeah, I think it's partly to do with the history of these debates, to do with innateness. In that it's kind of hard to hear talk of the innate without having in mind, at least if one's a philosopher, these old old kind of traditional debates. Whereas really, I think the old debates are kind of orthogonal or just kind of independent of the kind of contemporary issues. The main, I suppose, stumbling block comes with the issue of poverty as stimulus, which we could perhaps kind of talk about.
Definitely.
Yeah. So this clearly is there in, say, Plato, and you certainly find it in Descartes and Leibniz as well. And it's this idea that you find the development of a competence, or exercise, or a cognitive capacity, free of stimulus, or characterized by a poverty of stimulus. So with Plato, it's Socrates demonstrating that Meno, slave boy, understands some relatively complex bit of geometry, independent of relevant tuition or experience. So for most purposes, you can understand Chomsky's appeal to the innate as more or less being equivalent to characterized by a poverty of stimulus. So what this, though, has led many people to believe is that Chomsky is making bold claims or bold speculations about the kind of stimulus available to children. Right? And it's like, well, how does Chomsky know what stimulus is available to children and what use they may make of that stimulus? I think Chomsky's reasoning, though, doesn't really depend upon any of those details. I mean, in fact, I think once one looks at the details, they go in Chomsky's favor. But anyway, the broad kind of conceptual move he's trying to make is to say, look, poverty as stimulus is it poses a kind of explanatory challenge, right? It's to say, look, how can it be that the child exhibits or comes to exhibit this enormously complex competence in the face of apparent poverty of stimulus? So in a sense, the explanatory burden is on those who would deny the innateness, right? Upon those who would deny that there are these underlying invariant principles that shape the development. Because it's those people who, in effect, saying the child relies upon rich stimuli. Whereas Chomsky is saying, well, look, it's not that the stimuli isn't rich, it might or might not be. The point is that the child doesn't use it. Right? So it's something like this. If you wanted a good theory of language acquisition, what you need to do is to figure out how little data the child needs, and then develop as a learning theory which can work on such little data, rather than the way it often goes, is that you give the kind of artificial model of a computer, like, the whole of the internet, and then say, gee, you know, the system, given the whole of the internet 500 times, can kind of work out some vague grammatical principle. It's very simple. Look, however way you cut it, you know that a child's acquisition of language is pretty kind of resilient or robust under variations of stimuli. So it's like saying, look, the phenomena here is that the child acquires the language without needing rich stimuli. So even if the stimuli is rich, then they appear not to be using it. I mean, just in a kind of very intuitive way, and this is evident to anyone who has children, try to correct children's, say, grammatical errors. I mean, they just ignore you. They're not interested. You know, it's just not something they it's like, you know, they just don't do it. Right? They're just not concerned whatsoever. And they're much more concerned with, you know, correction when it comes to issues of kind of politeness or humor and things like this. So to try to intervene, as it were, in the kind of language acquisition process is not straightforward at all.
That's very interesting. And kind of we've been talking already a little bit about the notion of kind of a faculty or a capacity. So can you maybe clarify kind of what are these two notions? How does Chomsky uses them? Maybe how do other contemporary philosophers use them? And kind of how can we make sense of them?
Yeah, so there's a number of different sort of concepts in the field, which is sometimes used in the same way and sometimes conflated. So by faculty, Chomsky really is just trying to put his finger on something which is specified kind of abstractly rather than, say, concretely in kind of neural terms. So when Chomsky would say, you know, the faculty of mind, a faculty of mind that is, as we're linguistic, the language faculty, he's not suggesting that there is a particular area of the brain which one could as well cut out. I mean, there might or might not be, right? But it's not that kind of claim. The claim would be, it'd be more similar to, say, something like the immune system. You know, the immune system is just as we're distributed all over the body, it's in every cell and so forth. Right? So the faculty of language isn't something that's, as we're sort of physically discrete or even necessarily identifiable independently of the kinds of principles which one would, you know, sort of develop theoretically. Whereas the notion, say, Jerry Fodor's notion of a module, which is, you know, has a lot of currency, Fodor meant that much more in terms of a piece of kind of hardware, and which is connected with various kinds of transduction mechanisms like senses. You know, Chomsky means the notion of faculty in a much more kind of abstract sense than that. It's a notion that's only in view from a certain kind of computational perspective, rather than as well as a concrete component of the brain.
Okay, very interesting.
I should say as well, there's a kind of sense in which a notion of faculty is very loose, right? So you could just mean it in terms of a capacity, right? Well, if you mean it in those terms, I have, you know, endless number of capacities, right? I have a capacity to open a door, right? But nobody wants to say that the faculty of opening doors. Or I have a capacity to lift up a spade. I try not to, but you know. The point being, though, is that it only becomes interesting to think, to hypothesize about particular faculties if you think the capacities involved have certain kind of unique underlying principles. Right? So the kind of capacities that are involved in my opening a door or lifting a spade that is more or less the same kind of thing, right? Even though I can specify these capacities in different terms. So it's only once one has reason to think that there are certain kind of unique or special principles involved that it becomes interesting to hypothesize a particular faculty.
And we also talked a little bit before already about the science forming faculty, but just digging a little bit deeper into that, I think you also have written an article about this, that of course Chomsky kind of speculates on this, so he's not necessarily saying there is this kind of science forming faculty that we can kind of approach or dig deeper into, but how should we understand this sort of faculty, and do you think indeed that this faculty is plausible when we kind of look at it concretely?
Yeah, I think that's, yeah. I think Chomsky's notion of a science forming faculty doesn't really fit with, say, the notion of faculty as he uses it in the notion of language.
Yep.
I think, as I was suggesting earlier, I think you can, somewhat speculatively, say there are certain broad principles that lead us to converge and favor certain kinds of theory, value certain kinds of explanations over others and things like this. And you can look at the history of science and say, look, these broad trends have shaped scientific development and so on and so forth. So there might well be good reason to think that science as we know it and as we appreciate it and we converge in different theories has a cognitive basis. So that's one thing. So then say there's a faculty of it, it seems to me is somewhat of a leap. Chomsky himself has noted that one clear difference is that when we speak of a faculty of mind, whether it be, say, to do with language or to do with arithmetic or to do with, say, face recognition or theory of mind, all of these things have a clear developmental profile and kind of universal traits, you know, of the species and so on and so forth. Whereas, like, you know, doing science just isn't like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, I'm just thinking, like, kind of, because indeed this seems to be kind of a very general and loose, indeed, faculty when we talk about kind of the faculty of science. And I wonder then, for example, if you would compare this, for example, to Kant talking about the faculty of reason, kind of the highest level of generality related to thinking, for example. Like, what would you say about that? Like, where does it stop? Kind of maybe from that level, it's kind of crucial, for example, from a Kantian perspective, saying, okay, if we actually look into reason, we seem to actually run into these major contradictions within reason. So how can we actually make sense of indicate reason itself? You know, so that's not necessarily Chomsky's approach, I guess, but maybe interesting indeed to just, in your opinion, see, okay, if we have these two different ways of characterizing faculties, and from one hand, we can do it quite concretely, saying, okay, the faculty of language, and on the other hand, we can maybe do it at its most high general level, namely the faculty of reason. How do we make sense of that?
No, I actually think that analogy is quite quite interesting. Actually, I mean, I think it's something kind of like that, where, so, you know, say in Kant, if one thinks of something like the understanding, then the various categories involved in the understanding, then one can see those things in direct application to deliver up, you know, kind of knowledge of the world around us and of ourselves, whereas reason appears to be something that kind of is always looking to kind of transcend those boundaries, or at least gives us a sense of beyond those boundaries, which in a sense is precisely what science in Chomsky's sense kind of does do, right? So a lot of the work on the psychology of scientific understanding so say, for instance, work by Elizabeth Spelke and others, they look at, say, children's commonsensical principles governing behavior of objects around them. And these tend to be somewhat kind of classical, as it were. Do you know what I mean? They're assumptions of how objects ought to behave. But obviously these assumptions break down if the objects are moving very, very fast, like near light speed, or they're massive, like planets, right? Then it's like, well, your faculty of, as it were, commonsensical physics just breaks down. It doesn't tell you anything about it. Whereas for Chomsky, in a sense, the kind of faculty of science sort of like steps in and is able to give a kind of broad sense of how you ought to kind of think about these things in a way that departs from kind of common sense.
Yeah. Very interesting. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, so focusing on Chomsky's famous review, indeed, of Skinner's verbal behavior. I mean, that's kind of often be interpreted and read as arguments against, for example, empiricism, and arguments in favor of mentalism and nativism. And you have quite a unique or different interpretation, stating that kind of this review was merely a negative point by Chomsky. So can you maybe explain your interpretation of Chomsky's review of Skinner? What are kind of the main takeaways that we can get out of it, but where should we kind of be hesitant in kind of starting to say that he's actually also putting forward some positive points?
Yeah, so what's kind of really going on in the Skinner review, if you sort of read it carefully, and I don't want to suggest people haven't read it carefully, although there kind of is a sense of it's one of those texts which I get the sense of people cite more often than they read. But anyway, is what he really accuses Skinner of doing is just retreating to kind of mentalism, as he puts it. Right? So Skinner presents himself as being not so much kind of logical behaviorist. That's to say, Skinner isn't in the business of analyzing mental terms in terms of, say, dispositions or behavior. What he's trying to do is, in a way, to, as we get rid of the mental, or in a sense, to understand everything that we would previously have categorized in mental terms, in terms of a complex regime of kind of stimulus response. So if Skinner is to do this, what he needs to do is, in a sense, to show that everything which, and in particular, kind of our linguistic behavior, our utterances, are in fact responses to independently identifiable stimuli, to which they are responses. Right? And Chomsky's thought is that, look, it's pretty plain that Skinner spectacularly fails in doing this, but the only reason he appears, as it were, not to fail, perhaps, or at least to himself he appears not to fail, is because he's categorizing these various responses in mentalistic kind of terms. Right? So it's a sort of, so for instance, it almost becomes sort of slightly absurd. So it's the idea of saying, so what's the reference of a name? Right? And it's, well, it's a thing it kind of refers to. But then the notion of reference here is already, as it were, kind of mentalistic in some sense. So Chomsky then speculates, so really what Skinner means is the reference of a name would be that thing that would produce the stimulus. Right? So it's in effect is kind of like the consequence of this would then be, given that I'm now facing you, if I'm competent with a name, I should start saying Fabian, 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 Fabian. Well, that's fine. Obviously, I don't do that. I mean, you know, I could be perfectly competent with your name without actually ever using it. Right? And so on and so forth. So in a sense, the criticism of Skinner is that he fails to be a kind of objective behaviorist according to his own standards. What he's doing is just as we're indulging in a kind of grade mentalism, right? And he says he's kind of play acting at science. Yeah. But then the kind of consequence of that, many people saw mentalism. Yeah. But you don't really find that in the review or indeed elsewhere. What Chomsky is instead, the kind of positive suggestion, and this comes right at the end of the paper, right at the end of the paper, he says, so what's the alternative? And he says, well, maybe it's something like this. What he suggests is something like, still less a kind of commonsensical mentalism. It's rather just a kind of defense of the organism, right? So we're saying, look, if you're looking at the development of a complex trait, then there are going to be two factors, the properties of the organism and the properties of the stimuli. What happens in Skinner is that you completely forget about the properties of the organism. So let's just focus on, well, what are the properties of the organism and what kinds of properties would allow for the development of language? And okay, so that's our topic. That isn't a kind of defense of mentalism in the kind of traditional, in sort of traditional way of thinking of it.
And so when people talk about kind of the folk psychology notions, you also talk about kind of Chomsky mentioning a meta-scientific eliminativism. So maybe what is kind of this meta-scientific view that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so it's this really comes into kind of focus in some of Chomsky's writings from the 1990s, where he is sort of somewhat explicit about not endorsing a kind of traditional kind of mentalism. And for some people, this was somewhat odd, because it's the idea being, well, hang on, Chomsky's a great champion of mentalism going all the review. And I think he said, well, actually, if you look at the Skinner review, you don't really find a defense of mentalism. You simply find a defense of kind of internal structure.
Yeah.
So I think the Chomsky's, if you like, skepticism about mentalism, as it's so traditionally understood, is that he often puts sort of constraints upon inquiry. Again, this goes back to the issue of methodological naturalism, where one says, but look, if you're thinking of a mental state, then you must be thinking of it as representation, as having intentional properties. All mental states are about things. This is often expressed as Brentano's thesis, the Austrian kind of philosopher psychologist, Franz Brentano. He said that all and only mental states are intentional. They have aboutness. Well, if you then ask, well, if that's so, and Chomsky's involved in mentalism, then he must be involved in intentionality in thinking, so the mind represents a grammar. Well, what's that? How does a mind represent a grammar? What is the nature of representation? And so on and so forth. And I think it's not so much that Chomsky thinks there are no questions to be raised about the nature of representation and what is it to represent a grammar, or what is it to represent a Euclidean solid. So, for instance, in lots of vision science, we speak about the kind of the mind representing Euclidean solids and things like this. Right? It's not that there aren't any questions to be asked there. It's rather that probably the best way of pursuing these questions is not to think that there's a clear sense of intentionality, which aboutness, which is going to apply to every single instance. So it's going to apply to pictures, it's going to apply to signposts, it's going to apply to navigating ants, it's going to apply to the mind representing the grammar. Do you know what I mean? It may well be that there just is no unified notion of representation.
Yeah.
Even though there appears to be, given the way we normally talk about representation. You know, it's difficult to talk about representation without thinking of a represented, you know, representation of something.
Yeah, exactly.
But then that's just, so I think part of Chomsky's worry here is, as soon as you start talking about representation and you bring intentionality on board, it then focuses inquiry into these kinds of philosophical issues that tend to be preoccupied with kind of naturalizing intentionality or finding a unity to every possible instance of intentionality.
Yeah, that's very interesting. One thing that I noticed is also that you mentioned in your book, many interpreters link Chomsky indeed to the Cartesian tradition. That's kind of normal characterization. And you state that in that sense, you can see Chomsky as aligning himself with Descartes, whereas both of their concerns are primarily epistemological. You mentioned, for example, that Jerry Fodor holds this kind of view and is one of the main interpreters along these lines. And on this view, Chomsky would indeed be concerned with kind of what is the innate knowledge of language that we're talking about. And you think actually, and that was very surprising and interesting that you say, you think it's a mistake to read Chomsky along these lines. So why do you think it is a mistake, kind of this close connection, and what is indeed the relation between Chomsky and the Cartesian tradition, and how is Chomsky's focus in the end different than a pretty epistemological approach?
Yeah, so Chomsky's favorite phrase going from the 1960s up until at least the 80s was knowledge of language. And so Jerry Fodor and many other people took this kind of straightforwardly as saying, so what Chomsky is concerned with is what a speaker kind of knows. So it's as if you're suggesting that a competent speaker knows that P, where P is some specification of a grammar or principle of a grammar, and the only difference really is that it's kind of unconscious, something like that. I think one of the problems, I mean, there are a number of problems here. I mean, one chief issue, which Chomsky has mentioned a number of times, is there's a kind of there's a kind of distinction between the theorist and the object of the theory, which when one is dealing with a kind of human being, it's not always straightforward to make that kind of distinction, especially if one's thinking about cognitive kind of properties. So the thought is something like this. Look, the theorist would specify the grammar as something that could be, as it were, known, right? Because the theorist knows it, right? And you attribute that grammar to the speaker, right? Or you attribute properties of a grammar to a speaker. But it doesn't follow, in attributing that knowledge to a speaker, that the speaker knows the grammar in the same way as the theorist knows the grammar. So, I mean, to give a kind of example of this, there are lots of things a grammar would tell you about, or should tell you about, which in effect amount to kind of laws or generalizations about how a grammar works or operates. But these aren't things which somebody who has the grammar needs to know in any way. I mean, these are just constraints upon how the system can kind of operate. So what a grammar tries to do to a large extent is to specify the kind of conditions upon the grammar. And these are not things which a speaker, hearer, needs to explicitly represent at all. Right? So again, I could go through particular kind of examples, but it gets a bit kind of complicated looking at the detail. But the general thought here is that there are going to be things a speaker kind of knows because they can, in a commonsensical sense, about their language, because they can bring it to consciousness, let's say. There are other things that are unconscious, and the speaker may not be able to bring them to consciousness at all, but nevertheless could be kind of, in some sense, explicitly represented. But there are going to be lots of other things which would be specified in a theorist's grammar, which are just not of that nature at all. These are just going to be general constraints upon how the system kind of operates.
I see. That's very interesting. I mean, just clarifying kind of, for example, I also, because here theory seems to be kind of a crucial role in understanding kind of what knowledge we're talking about. And it's mostly this theory building where we kind of need to situate then what that knowledge kind of means in kind of the scope of the theory, right? That's kind of what it sounds like. So just to clarify, in some sense, like then this relation between indeed just kind of epistemological questions and kind of theory building questions, are they some kind of sometimes separable, and do they relate maybe at different phases, or how would I understand that kind of relation?
Okay, I think I follow what you mean, but just a little bit of history. So, like, if you go back to the 1960s, there was this, Chomsky suggested that what the language acquiring child must kind of do is to, in effect, test principles against the kind of data. And then it seems natural on that model that, look, the child must, in some sense, be representing these principles to itself, albeit unconsciously, and then seeing if the data is compatible with these principles, according to whatever mechanism you kind of judge compatibility by. By the time, though, you hit the kind of late 70s, early 80s, the conception of a grammar had really radically kind of changed. So it's not that each grammar, so a grammar for French, or a grammar for English, or a grammar for Swahili, would contain its own particular principles. Rather, the principles would be the same across all languages. And what the child needs to do is to, as the expression has had it, is to set certain parameters. So there are just certain options available to a child, and then as soon as certain data is witnessed, a switch gets flipped, as it were. So in some sense, in acquiring a language, at no point is a child representing principles to itself and seeing if the language corresponds to those principles. So I think that a development in the theory made it kind of plain, as it were, that the notion of representation involved here doesn't really require the child to be representing principles to itself in order for these to be kind of tested. Robert Matthews had some kind of papers about this in the kind of early 80s, which I think were the first kind of instances of somebody trying to kind of problematize the notion of kind of knowledge in relation to a grammar in this respect.
Very interesting. Kind of focusing on another famous distinction by Chomsky between kind of an I language and an E language. So can you maybe briefly explain this distinction, and again, its relevance for Chomsky? And also in your book, you argue that E language sometimes seems to be kind of ill-suited to answer certain questions that we would like to answer. Namely, for example, you mentioned four in particular, namely acquisition, language use, evolution, and neurological realization. So maybe just kind of, again, the broad picture, the distinction between I language and E language, and kind of what's the explanatory scope of each of these notions, and how should we then evaluate what to do with this distinction?
Yeah, so in broad terms, the E language is just a more or less kind of commonsensical idea of a kind of public language. Mm-hmm. So E there kind of loosely stands for external and extensional. Right? So the idea being, you think of a language as a kind of set of sentences, let's say. Mm-hmm. Whereas I language, the I kind of stands for internal, mm-hmm. individual, and intentional. Mm-hmm. So intentional there means you think of a language in terms of a certain kind of procedure, or you think of it as a grammar. So it's a kind of difference between thinking of a language, or thinking of language, or approaching linguistic phenomena as being external to the mind, or rather you're thinking of linguistic phenomena as being grounded in various kinds of principles, mm-hmm. Which are realized in the mind. So that's just a broad distinction. Mm-hmm. And the way Chomsky introduces this isn't to say something like the E-language notion is kind of meaningless or anything like that. It's rather to say that, look, you can think about the way different lines of inquiry or different research programs are animated, mm-hmm. by different conceptions of language. So you say, look, the generative kind of research program is really animated by a kind of I language notion. Right? What we're interested in is the kind of internally realized procedure that's particular to an individual kind of organism. It's going to be, more or less the same as other organisms, but we're talking about something that's a property of individual organisms, rather than a kind of, some kind of socio-cultural, historical kind of entity that's independent of any particular organisms. And then, in terms of the if you like, the kind of relative evaluation of these notions, the thought is just, but look, insofar as the generative research program has been successful, it lends weight to this general I language notion. Mm-hmm. And then the thought is, and look, it has been relatively successful. So the way you inquire into language is by, in effect, having this kind of conception of language. Mm-hmm. The E-language conception, on the other hand, and this relates to what I was saying earlier about public languages, mm-hmm. It doesn't seem to essentially be involved in any, kind of successful kind of research program. What you basically find is that it kind of coheres with common sense. Although even that is kind of questionable, actually, if you start to think about it. But at best, it's a kind of commonsensical notion. But, well, again, if we're doing science, we shouldn't be beholden to common sense in that way. But you sometimes find people saying things like, Chomsky says E-languages don't exist. I mean, he never says that. Yeah. He kind of says, look, let there be E-languages. If you can, if you can go out and define an E-language, great, do so. It's not interesting. What's going to be of interest is if that notion is actually entailed or presupposed in successful inquiry. And his claim is this E-language notion really isn't.
Very interesting. Actually, one thing, a discussion that I also noticed is kind of the discussion between data and theory, and then related kind of in the general context of kind of linguistic intuitions. So there has been a lot of philosophical debate about kind of what this amounts to and how we should understand or how reliable these intuitions are. So can you maybe kind of lay out your view of what is the linguistic data that we're working with? How should the data be constrained, and what is the role between indeed data and theory building, and what's the role of intuitions in that, and how should we take that role?
Yeah, so you're right to say there has been a lot of work done, so both philosophical and empirical, on the status of intuitions. If you look at Chomsky's very earliest work, he kind of says, well, we have to rely upon intuitions, but wouldn't it be good if we didn't have to? By the time you kind of reach the kind of early 60s, he kind of changed his mind a bit and said, yeah, we have to rely upon intuitions, and they're perfectly fine. So I think the first thing to say here is that intuition, as the notion is used in linguistics, isn't the same as a kind of colloquial or commonsensical notion of intuition, which is a kind of unreflective hunch, right? So when the linguist is interested in a kind of speaker hearer's intuitions, they're kind of interested in that they have the intuitions they have about something being acceptable or not. They're not interested in those intuitions being, as it were, correct or not. Right? So they're not thinking of the informant, say the normal speaker, as being a kind of fellow linguist.
I see, yeah.
Right? They're expecting to be right about their language, right? Even if a speaker was wrong about their language, right, across a whole range of cases, that itself would be very interesting, because they're going to be wrong about it in systematic ways. Right? And it's a systematicity that tells you something about the kind of nature of the underlying system. So some of the philosophical worries about the reliance upon intuition, I think, are grounded in this idea that a speaker hearer has some kind of strange epistemological access to their own language, and how does that work? Whereas, again, as I said, I think it's perfectly coherent to think of a speaker hearer as often being wrong about their language, but still going to be interesting. That said, I think in a way, it's a kind of mistake to think of a speaker as having kind of direct intuitions about the language or about syntax. So Chomsky made he made use of this notion of acceptability. So it's the idea of saying what you're getting from a speaker is something like, this sentence is okay, it's acceptable, I can make sense of it. And that's, in a sense, all you're getting. Right? You're not interested in the reasons, as it were, why they might think that. I mean, in some cases you might be interested, right? But broadly speaking, you're not. So it might well be, in lots of cases, that a speaker would find it okay, but for, as it were, kind of extra grammatical reasons. Right? So for any given intuition, it's a kind of theoretical task to figure out what this intuition is telling you about the language. Right? So it's never, as it were, straightforward. So Michael Devitt, who's written quite a lot on this topic, thinks of a linguist as understanding intuitions as what he calls a kind of Cartesian voice of competence. Right? As if intuitions are a kind of mainlining the underlying cognitive systems. So, well, how can that be? And I think Michael's right to reject that conception. I just think he's wrong to attribute it to the linguist. I mean, I think, broadly speaking, linguists think of intuitions as as a kind of rough way of doing lots and lots of little, as it were, experiments. And broadly speaking, they are kind of successful. Another aspect to this is this idea that broadly speaking, the linguist is relying upon their own intuitions rather than intuitions of speakers. There's actually been some interesting work on this, where people have taken a syntax textbook and done an actual experiment on a class of informants to see whether the relevant intuitions of a linguist actually differ from, the kind of mass of English speakers. And they found that they don't. You know what I mean? So again, even if in practice, the linguist often relies upon their own intuitions, that's not a problem unless one has reason to think that those intuitions depart from the intuitions of, normal speakers.
That's interesting. Actually, one suggestion that I read also from Peter Ludloff was that he kind of argues that indeed maybe this notion of intuition is actually problematic, and that we should actually therefore try to characterize it as more of a judgment, but as kind of more a cognitive activity where we're judging and kind of more plays a role than just a rough intuition that we're dealing with. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, I think that's a good point, because there's a sense, and again, this comes from the kind of the normal meaning of intuition as being kind of unreflective and quick.
Yeah.
As if what the linguist is interested in is something an informant would just kind of snap out without thinking about it. Yeah. But that's not always the case. So there are lots of cases which linguists and semanticists, think about, that are incredibly delicate. And you start thinking about them, and you're like, gee, I really don't know what to think about these cases. But you're still thinking about these in a kind of intuitive way, right? You're trying to not to think about these things theoretically, but rather to think about them as well as just making available a certain interpretation or not. So there are lots of issues to do, say, with scope, right? About what scope a particular element has in a particular context. The only relevant constructions here are going to be fairly kind of baroque and peculiar, not the kind of things people would, normally come out with. I sometimes test my students on these kinds of cases, and the students would just haven't got a clue what this is about. So, so I think you're right. I think some of the time, what the linguist is trying to do is to make a kind of informed judgment. So it's not just a kind of snap, unreflective response to a sentence. I think the understanding is something like, with enough care and time, you could get any normal speaker to appreciate the relevant differences. It's just that, with a proviso that you're not giving them theory, right? So it oftentimes helps if you have lots of different sentences, right? So typically when you look at, say, work in linguistics, it's not that you're just having one sentence and you're saying, think about this sentence. You'd have a whole range of sentences that differ, right, in slightly different ways, and you're being asked, can you get this interpretation here but not there? Are there two interpretations here and only one there, and things like that? And that kind of dealing with that sort of pattern within sentences takes some kind of familiarity. I think the idea, though, and I think this seems to be correct, that you could get any competent speaker in a position to do that, independence of theory. So that's just a very long way of saying, yes, I kind of agree. Oftentimes, intuition is more about a somewhat delicate judgment than just the first thing that comes into your head.
Very interesting. So kind of maybe as my final question, and also what you're discussing kind of the last chapter of your book, you talk about the Minimalist Program, and you state that the program tries to ask, why is language the way it is? Can you maybe briefly sketch what this program is about, and maybe also what are some of the philosophical questions that arise in this framework or from this framework that are, for example, relevant for the philosopher?
Yeah. So the Chomsky has on occasion described the minimalist program as what he says is a going beyond explanatory adequacy. Mm-hmm. So the kind of idea there being in the early work, you had these two constraints, these two conditions of adequacy. So you want a grammar to be empirically accurate. Mm-hmm. So you wanted to accurately give the properties of the various constructions in the language. And you also want it to be explanatory adequate. So you want a story of how it is that a child could acquire that kind of grammar. Mm-hmm. The idea of going beyond explanatory adequacy is then the thought of, so why is a language like that? Mm-hmm. And the thought here is, you're really trying to, as Chomsky sometimes puts it, that you're trying to think of a language as if it was designed. Mm-hmm. But it's designed as well, kind of without there being a kind of designer. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, Chomsky has sometimes joked, the only thing wrong with the idea of intelligent design is the idea of God. Mm-hmm. So it's the thought that, in essence, language, syntax at least, is a system that connects a kind of sign with a meaning. Mm-hmm. And the question is, so what kind of mechanism would connect a sign with a meaning? And in a sense, syntax is going to be the answer to that kind of engineering problem. How do you connect these two independent systems together? Mm-hmm. And then I think there are lots of different interesting aspects to this, but the kind of guiding assumption Chomsky entertains is, imagine that this is perfect, right? So imagine that it's a perfect solution. The idea here being, it's a kind of solution which is going to optimally fit these both kind of these two conditions, right? But then if you adopt that perspective, then it seems that language is, as we're full of imperfections, mm-hmm. right? So this comes back to the issue of communication. Mm-hmm. Language looks to be highly kind of counter-functional, mm-hmm. right? So you look at language and say, it's full of ambiguity, it's full of, as it were, sort of gaps in sentences where you mm-hmm. interpret something to be, even though there's nothing there, and so on and so forth. So what the minimalist program, in essence, tries to do is to explain how grammar or syntax could be this kind of perfect system. Mm-hmm. This relates quite closely to issues in evolution. Mm-hmm. So in the earliest work, when language was perceived to be very complex, mm-hmm. The problem then was, well, how could you imagine such a complex thing as having been evolved? Mm-hmm. Now, if you're thinking of grammar as being something very, very simple, like this optimal solution to this problem of fitting mm-hmm. meaning with sound, the idea is then it becomes plausible to imagine how this system could have evolved. Mm-hmm. At least that's one kind of leading idea. Mm. In terms of, for me at least personally, it's real philosophical interest is, it means, well, one of the things it means is that when you look at language from a kind of semantic perspective, one should be trying to not attribute to language any properties just for the sake of getting an interpretation. Mm. Right? And there's a kind of tradition of thinking of at least one aspect of grammar as encoding as with meaning in some sense on the meaning side.
Yep.
So therefore one can posit in the syntax anything one likes, more or less, in order to get the right meaning.
I see.
And this was kind of more or less made sense in the earlier models, but in the kind of minimalist model, it kind of means that no, right, because everything that's in the grammar should have a particular kind of grammatical kind of explanation, right? If it's just kind of perfectly simple system. So what I've tried to do in a very recent book of mine is to say, well, if you approach language in this minimalist spirit, what this does is to really offer a defense of what's sometimes referred to as linguistic pragmatism. Connects up with people like John Austin and kind of Paul Travis, and it's just kind of ordinary language, kind of like philosophy, or at least that kind of tradition. Right? It's a sort of idea that truth conditions, it was not the kind of thing that are going to be pinned upon syntax in this minimalist kind of spirit. They're going to be much more kind of high level kind of communicative effects if you've got this minimal syntax. That, at least that's the sort of general approach.
Very interesting. Well, Professor Collins, this has been a very interesting conversation. So thank you so much for your time. Do you have any parting words to the audience?
No, except there's no alternative than to read the man himself.
That's true. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great.